The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of our penthouse, spraying glass across my bare feet. My husband Derek stood in the doorway of what used to be our bedroom, his suitcases already packed, his lawyer already retained, his new girlfriend already wearing the necklace I'd admired in the jewelry store window just 3 months ago. 22 years of marriage dissolved in the time it took him to say he'd fallen in love with his personal trainer and wanted me out by Friday. The penthouse we'd built together, the life we'd constructed with such careful precision, the future we'd planned down to our retirement villa in Tuscany, all of it evaporated like morning fog. He handed me divorce papers with the same casual indifference he used when signing credit card receipts. I had 72 hours to pack up 2 decades and leave. No discussion. No counseling. No second chances. Just a cold deadline and the sound of his footsteps walking away for the last time, leaving me standing in a sea of broken crystal and broken promises. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Part 1, the breaking point. I spent that first night sitting on the cold bathroom floor, my phone clutched in trembling hands, scrolling through decades of photos that now felt like evidence of an elaborate lie. Every vacation snapshot, every anniversary dinner, every carefully curated image of marital bliss suddenly looked different, like those optical illusions where once you see the hidden image, you can never unsee it. How long had Derek been planning this? How many of these smiling photos were taken while he was already planning his exit? The questions spiraled through my mind like a storm I couldn't escape. Friday arrived with brutal efficiency. The moving truck Derek had hired without consulting me idled in the circular driveway of our building, its diesel engine rumbling like a death knell for the life I'd known. I'd barely slept in 3 days, surviving on coffee and the mechanical motions of wrapping dishes in newspaper, folding clothes into boxes, dismantling the physical structure of a marriage I'd believed was solid. My hands moved automatically while my mind remained stuck in a loop of disbelief. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't supposed to be my story. The movers Derek hired were efficient and emotionless, treating my life's possessions like inventory on a warehouse manifest. I watched them carry out the antique sideboard we'd bought at an estate sale in Vermont, the one we'd driven 3 hours to see and another 3 hours back, laughing the whole way about the eccentric old woman who'd sold it to us. I watched them load the custom dining table where we'd hosted countless dinner parties, where I'd perfected my risotto recipe and learned to pair wines and pretended to enjoy conversations with Derek's business associates while my own career aspirations quietly withered. Each piece of furniture that disappeared into the truck took a piece of my identity with it. By noon, the penthouse stood nearly empty. The walls showed pale rectangles where artwork had hung. The hardwood floors bore scuff marks from furniture that would never return. The space echoed with absence. Derek appeared briefly, immaculate in his tailored suit, fresh from what he claimed was a business meeting but was probably brunch with his trainer. He walked through each room with a clipboard, checking off items like a hotel manager inspecting a vacated suite. "The key," he said, extending his hand without meeting my eyes. No farewell. No acknowledgement of the years we'd shared. Just an outstretched palm waiting for me to surrender the last physical connection to this life. I dropped the key into his hand, the small metallic clink impossibly loud in the empty space. He nodded once and turned toward the door. That's when something inside me fractured completely. Not broke, fractured, like safety glass that holds its shape even after impact but will never be solid again. "Derek," I heard myself say. My voice sounded strange, distant, like it belonged to someone else. He paused but didn't turn around. "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" His shoulders tensed. For a moment I thought he might actually turn around, might actually show some flicker of the man I'd married when we were both young and stupid and convinced that love was enough. Instead, he spoke to the doorframe. "You'll figure it out, Christine. You always do." Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hallway, the elevator chiming its arrival, the sound of doors closing on more than just a metal box. I stood in the empty penthouse, surrounded by the few items Derek had deemed mine to keep, a pathetically small pile for 2 decades of life. A floor lamp. 3 boxes of kitchen items he didn't want. My clothes and personal effects. The stack of books I'd collected but never read because I was too busy managing his social calendar. The driver of the moving truck appeared in the doorway, his weathered face showing the first hint of compassion I'd encountered all day. "Ma'am, where am I taking this stuff?" He gestured to the loaded truck, then to me standing alone in the empty apartment. The question hung in the air like smoke. Where was I going? Derek had been the primary name on the lease of this penthouse. Our vacation home in the mountains was in his name, a tax thing he'd explained years ago that I'd been too trusting to question. Our joint bank accounts had been mysteriously drained 2 weeks ago, which I'd discovered only when my credit card was declined at the grocery store. The lawyer Derek hired had been thorough. I had a temporary account with enough to survive for a few months if I was careful, but nothing resembling the life I'd grown accustomed to. "The storage facility," I finally answered, handing him an address I'd Googled the night before. The cheapest one I could find, in a part of the city I'd never visited, where my carefully curated furniture and designer clothes would sit in a climate-controlled unit while I figured out what came next. The driver nodded sympathetically. "You got a place to stay tonight?" The question struck me with unexpected force. I didn't. In a city where I'd lived for 15 years, I had nowhere to go. The friends I'd cultivated were really Derek's business associates' wives, women who'd already stopped returning my calls once word of the divorce spread through our social circle like wildfire. My own friends from before the marriage had drifted away over the years, casualties of my single-minded focus on being the perfect corporate wife. My parents had retired to Arizona, to a small condo community where they played golf and attended early bird dinners, where there was no space for a daughter in crisis. "I'll find something," I told the driver, though I had no idea what that something might be. After the truck pulled away, I stood on the sidewalk outside the building where I'd lived for over a decade, holding a single suitcase and my purse. The doorman who'd greeted me every morning for years avoided my eyes as I walked past, already instructed by building management that I was no longer a resident. The spring afternoon was unreasonably beautiful, the kind of weather that made the city feel alive with possibility. Young professionals hurried past with their coffee and their purpose. Couples strolled hand in hand through the park across the street. The world continued its rotation with complete indifference to the fact that mine had stopped spinning. I pulled out my phone and opened a hotel booking app, scrolling through options with growing desperation. The decent hotels cost more per night than I could justify spending. The cheap ones had reviews mentioning bedbugs and suspicious stains and noises through thin walls. I settled on something in between, a budget chain hotel near the airport, the kind of anonymous space where people stayed when they were between lives, when they were neither here nor there, when they'd fallen through the cracks of normal existence. The taxi ride took 40 minutes, carrying me away from the gleaming downtown core to the industrial sprawl near the airport. I watched the city change through the window, the architecture degrading from historic brownstones to modern glass towers to strip malls and auto repair shops. By the time we reached the hotel, I felt like I'd traveled to another country entirely. The room was exactly what I'd paid for, clean but soulless, with industrial carpet and a polyester bedspread and a painting of a lighthouse bolted to the wall. I set my suitcase by the door and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded in my lap like a child in timeout. The air conditioning unit beneath the window rattled and hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a television played too loudly. A plane roared overhead, shaking the building slightly as it climbed into the sky, carrying people toward destinations and purposes while I sat motionless in a room that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and other people's temporary desperation. That's when the tears finally came, not the gentle crying of sadness but the violent sobbing of someone whose entire foundation has collapsed beneath them. I cried for the marriage I'd believed in. I cried for the years I'd spent molding myself into what I thought Derek wanted. I cried for the career I'd abandoned when he suggested it would be easier if one of us stayed flexible for his business obligations. I cried for the children we'd never had, a topic we'd always said we'd address next year, then the year after, then eventually stopped discussing altogether. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen and the sky outside had darkened into night. When the tears finally stopped, I found myself staring at my reflection in the mirror above the desk. The woman looking back was almost unrecognizable. Her hair hung limp and uncombed. Her expensive blouse was wrinkled from 3 days of chaos. Her eyes held an expression of such profound loss that I had to look away. Who was this person? Without Derek, without the penthouse, without the carefully constructed identity of successful wife, who was Christine Parker? I opened my laptop, intending to search for apartments, but instead found myself scrolling through job listings. My degree in architecture had been gathering dust for nearly 2 decades. I'd worked for exactly 18 months after graduation before Derek's career took off, and he suggested I could be more helpful supporting him than competing in the same field. At the time, it had seemed romantic, a partnership where we each played to our strengths. Now it looked like something else entirely. A calculated move to make me dependent. A way to ensure I had nowhere to go if things fell apart. The job listings were discouraging. Every position wanted recent experience, current portfolio work, familiarity with software that hadn't existed when I'd left the field. I closed the laptop, the hopelessness settling over me like a weighted blanket. At 43 years old, I was starting from zero. No recent work history. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. No professional network. No financial cushion beyond the minimal settlement Derek's lawyer had offered, take it or spend years fighting for more. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. For a moment, hope flickered that Derek had reconsidered, that this nightmare had an expiration date. Instead, the message was from his lawyer, a curt reminder that I had 30 days to respond to the settlement offer or they would proceed with litigation. The clinical language, the absence of any human warmth, the reduction of 2 decades to legal terminology and dollar amounts, it all reinforced the brutal reality. This wasn't a temporary rough patch. This was the permanent end of everything I'd built my adult life around. I ordered takeout from a Chinese restaurant, the kind of generic American Chinese food that tasted the same everywhere, and ate it mechanically while watching television without registering what was on the screen. The fortune cookies message seemed almost cruel in its optimism. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. I crumpled it and threw it in the trash, unable to see any journey ahead, unable to imagine taking even one step into a future that looked like nothing but empty space. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the unfamiliar sounds of the hotel and the relentless replay of the past 3 days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Derek's face in the doorway, heard his dismissive tone, felt the key dropping into his palm. Morning arrived with weak sunlight filtering through the thin curtains and the sound of housekeeping carts rattling in the hallway. I'd survived one night. The accomplishment felt simultaneously monumental and pathetic. I spent the day in practical tasks that kept my hands busy and my mind from spiraling. I opened a new bank account in only my name. I changed my mailing address to a P.O. box. I called the storage facility to confirm my furniture had arrived. I updated my resume, though the act of summarizing my professional life revealed how little I had to show for the past 2 decades. Each task was a small declaration of independence, a tiny act of self-preservation, but they felt hollow, like going through motions without purpose. By the 3rd day in the hotel, the walls had started closing in. I couldn't stay here indefinitely, bleeding money on temporary housing while I figured out a permanent plan. I needed something cheaper, somewhere I could catch my breath and regroup. I started searching for sublets, for house-sitting opportunities, for anything that would buy me time without draining my limited resources. That's when I found the listing. A cottage in a small town 3 hours north, available for 6 months while the owners traveled abroad. The rent was shockingly low, explained by the remote location and lack of amenities. No television. Unreliable internet. Closest grocery store 15 miles away. The photos showed a tiny structure that was generous to call a cottage, more like a cabin, nestled among pine trees with a view of a lake. It looked like the opposite of everything my life had been, isolated and simple and impossibly far from the urban sophistication I'd spent years cultivating. I stared at the listing for almost an hour, my cursor hovering over the contact button. This felt like more than just securing temporary housing. It felt like a choice between trying to rebuild some version of my old life or stepping into something completely unknown. The old life would mean staying in the city, networking my way back into architecture, competing with people half my age who hadn't taken 20-year breaks. It would mean facing mutual friends and explaining my situation over and over. It would mean living in the shadow of what I'd lost, constantly reminded of the life that had been taken from me. The cottage represented something else entirely. Escape, yes, but also possibility. A blank slate. A place where no one knew me as Derek's wife, where I wouldn't have to explain or justify or pretend to be holding it together. A place where I could fall apart completely if I needed to, or rebuild from scratch if I found the strength. My finger pressed the contact button before my rational mind could intervene. Within an hour, I'd spoken with the owner, a woman named Margaret whose voice was warm and asked no probing questions about why a single woman needed emergency housing in the middle of nowhere. She seemed content with my offer to pay 3 months up front, using nearly half of my available funds, a risk that should have terrified me but instead felt like the first real decision I'd made in years. "The cottage is yours," Margaret said, and I heard keys jingling on her end of the phone. "I'll leave everything you need under the flower pot by the front door. The lake is beautiful this time of year. Peaceful. Sometimes that's exactly what a person needs." After we hung up, I sat very still in the hotel room, aware that I'd just committed to something irreversible. No turning back now. No safety net. Just a cottage in the woods and whatever remained of the woman I used to be before I became Derek's wife, before I learned to disappear into someone else's life so completely that I forgot I'd once had dreams of my own. I packed my single suitcase, checked out of the hotel, and pointed my car north toward a town whose name I could barely pronounce and a future I couldn't begin to imagine. The highway stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through landscape that grew progressively wilder as the miles accumulated. I'd left the city at dawn, watching the skyline shrink in my rearview mirror until it disappeared completely, swallowed by the curvature of the earth. The radio stations gradually faded to static, forcing me to drive in silence broken only by the hum of tires on pavement and the occasional rush of a passing semi-truck. My hands gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force, knuckles white, as if holding tight enough could anchor me to something solid when everything else had dissolved. The GPS on my phone directed me off the interstate onto progressively smaller roads. 4 lanes became 2, then the pavement narrowed further, then gravel crunched beneath my tires as I turned onto what the map optimistically labeled a road but looked more like a suggestion scratched through the forest. Pine trees crowded close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy that turned midday into twilight. I'd been driving for nearly 4 hours, my lower back aching from tension and the cheap hotel mattress, when the GPS announced I'd arrived at my destination. The cottage appeared suddenly through a break in the trees, so small and unassuming I almost drove past it. Margaret's photos hadn't lied, but they had been generous in their angles. The structure was barely larger than a garden shed, weathered wood siding that might have been painted green once but had faded to the color of moss. A single window faced the driveway, its glass so dusty I couldn't see inside. The promised flower pot sat beside a front door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. I sat in the car for several minutes after turning off the engine, staring at this place that would be my home for the next 6 months. The silence was absolute. No traffic sounds, no sirens, no voices of neighbors, no urban soundtrack that had been the constant background noise of my entire adult life. Just wind moving through pine needles and somewhere distant, the call of a bird I couldn't identify. The isolation I'd craved from the safety of that hotel room suddenly felt suffocating. What had I done? What insanity had possessed me to drive hours into the wilderness to hide in a structure that might not even have running water? The key was exactly where Margaret promised, slightly rusty, attached to a wooden keychain carved in the shape of a fish. I picked it up, feeling its weight, aware that this small piece of metal represented a commitment I'd made in desperation and might regret in clarity. The door stuck when I tried to open it, swollen from humidity or age, requiring my shoulder pressed against it to finally give way with a protesting groan. The interior matched the exterior's modesty. One main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. An ancient wood stove crouched in one corner, its pipe disappearing through the ceiling. The kitchen consisted of a narrow counter, a sink with a hand pump instead of a faucet, and a propane camping stove that had seen better decades. A small table with 2 mismatched chairs sat beneath the window. A faded couch faced the wood stove, its upholstery worn smooth by generations of previous occupants. Through a doorway I found the bedroom, barely large enough for the full-size bed and a chest of drawers. The mattress looked old but clean, covered by a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. Another door revealed a bathroom with a toilet, a shower stall that appeared to have been added as an afterthought, and a mirror so spotted with age that my reflection looked like a ghost. I returned to the main room and stood in the center, slowly turning to take in my new reality. No television. No Wi-Fi router. No dishwasher or microwave or any of the conveniences I'd taken for granted. The silence pressed against my eardrums like physical pressure. In the city, silence never existed. There was always something, traffic or voices or music bleeding through walls or the hum of appliances. Here, the quiet was so complete it felt alive, watching, waiting to see what I would do next. My phone had one bar of signal, flickering in and out of existence. I opened my email reflexively, a habit so ingrained I didn't think about it, and watched as messages slowly loaded. Ads mostly, and automated notifications from services I'd forgotten I'd subscribed to. Nothing from Derek, not that I'd expected anything. Nothing from the friends who'd disappeared when my marriage imploded. Just the digital detritus of a life that no longer existed. I carried my suitcase inside and unpacked mechanically, hanging my expensive city clothes in a closet that smelled of pine and thyme. The act of organizing my belongings in this strange space felt like playing house, like a child arranging furniture in a dollhouse, pretending at a life without understanding its weight. My silk blouses looked absurd hanging in this rustic space. My designer shoes lined up on the closet floor were a joke. I'd packed for a life that had nothing to do with this reality. Exploring the property took less than 10 minutes. Behind the cottage, a dirt path led down to the lake Margaret had mentioned. The water stretched out calm and dark, reflecting the pine forest on the opposite shore like a mirror. A weathered dock extended about 20 feet into the water, its boards gray and warped but appearing structurally sound. I walked to the end and stood looking across the water, feeling the gentle give of the wood beneath my feet, aware of the depth below, the cold darkness that could swallow a person completely. The thought should have frightened me, but instead I felt a strange kinship with that dark water. I'd been swallowed already, by Derek's betrayal, by the dissolution of everything I'd believed about my life. Standing here at the edge of this remote lake felt like I'd already drowned and was now existing in some liminal space, not quite dead but no longer fully alive. I returned to the cottage as afternoon shadows began lengthening across the clearing. The sun would set early this far north, this deep in the forest. I needed to figure out basic survival before darkness fell completely. The propane stove required matches I found in a drawer, and after several attempts I managed to light it, the blue flames seeming impossibly cheerful in the dim cottage. The hand pump at the sink resisted at first, then surrendered with a groan, producing water that ran rust-colored for several seconds before clearing to cold transparency. I'd stopped at a grocery store in the last town I'd passed through, buying supplies at random, overwhelmed by the simple task of feeding myself. I heated a can of soup on the propane stove, poured it into a chipped bowl I found in the cabinet, and ate standing at the window watching daylight drain from the sky. The soup tasted like nothing, cardboard and salt, but I forced myself to finish it, aware that self-care now meant the most basic acts of survival. Eating. Sleeping. Continuing to exist from one moment to the next. Night arrived with shocking completeness. The darkness in the city never achieved true black, always diluted by streetlights and building lights and the ambient glow of urban existence. Here, darkness was absolute. I lit the oil lamp Margaret had left on the table, its flame casting dancing shadows that made the cottage feel even smaller, a tiny bubble of light surrounded by infinite nothing. I tried to read, opening one of the books I'd brought, but the words wouldn't form meaning. My eyes tracked across the page without comprehension, my mind too restless to settle into someone else's story when my own had become incomprehensible. I gave up after reading the same paragraph 5 times and turned off the lamp, navigating by moonlight to the bedroom where I collapsed onto the bed without bothering to change into pajamas. Sleep should have come easily after the exhaustion of the day, but instead I lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds. The cottage creaked and settled. Wind moved through the eaves with a sound like distant conversation. Something small scurried across the roof, probably a squirrel or raccoon. Every noise seemed amplified by the silence surrounding it, each one jerking me back from the edge of sleep to sharp awareness. When I finally did sleep, my dreams were fragmented and anxious. I was back in the penthouse, but all the furniture was gone and I was searching desperately for something I'd lost, something crucial, though I couldn't remember what. Derek appeared in doorways but disappeared before I could reach him. The rooms multiplied endlessly, each one empty, each one echoing with absence. I woke before dawn to bird sounds I'd never heard before, complex songs that seemed almost conversational. Gray light filtered through the thin curtains. My body ached from the unfamiliar mattress and the tension I'd carried for days without release. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, facing the reality that I had nowhere I needed to be, nothing I needed to do, no schedule or obligations or structure to my day. The freedom should have felt liberating. Instead it felt like drowning in open water with no shore in sight. The morning routine I established that first full day became a lifeline. Wake with the birds. Pump water for coffee, heating it on the propane stove. Sit at the table watching light gradually illuminate the clearing. These simple acts anchored me to something concrete when everything else felt untethered. I spent that first day simply existing in the space, walking the perimeter of the property, sitting on the dock, returning to the cottage when the isolation became too heavy to bear. By afternoon I was crawling out of my skin with restlessness. I'd existed for 2 decades with every moment scheduled, every action purposeful, every day divided into manageable segments of productivity. This aimless drifting felt wrong, made me feel useless in ways I hadn't anticipated. I needed something to do, some task to occupy my hands and mind. The cottage provided plenty of options. The window screens were torn, letting in mosquitoes. The front steps wobbled dangerously. The wood stove needed cleaning, its interior thick with old ash. I found tools in a shed behind the cottage, their handles worn smooth by previous hands, and set about making repairs with no idea what I was doing. I'd never fixed anything in my life. Derek had hired people for household repairs, and before Derek my father had handled such things. Now I stood alone with a screwdriver and determination born of desperation. The steps took me all afternoon to stabilize, requiring multiple trips to the shed for different tools, several smashed fingers, and language I didn't know I was capable of. When I finally finished, the steps were level and solid, and I felt a disproportionate pride in this small accomplishment. I'd made something better with my own hands. The satisfaction was unexpected and profound. That night I cooked actual food, eggs and toast on the propane stove, eating slowly while watching through the window as sunset painted the lake's surface gold and pink. The day had passed without me checking my phone obsessively. I hadn't thought about Derek for hours at a time. The constant mental loop of what went wrong and what I could have done differently had quieted to background noise rather than consuming static. The second day brought new challenges. The hand pump at the sink began making an alarming grinding sound. I spent an hour dismantling it, spreading parts across the counter, trying to understand how it worked. A couple hiking past stopped when they saw me struggling, and the woman, probably in her 60s with weathered hands and kind eyes, showed me which washer needed replacing and where to find the hardware store in town. Town turned out to be a cluster of buildings along a single main street, population maybe 300 if you counted the surrounding farms. The hardware store was exactly what you'd imagine, narrow aisles stocked floor to ceiling with tools and supplies that had nothing to do with my previous existence. The man behind the counter, grizzled and probably 70, looked at the worn washer I'd brought and nodded. "Cottage out on Miller Road?" he asked, already pulling a replacement from a drawer. Word traveled fast in small places, apparently. "Yes," I confirmed. "Just moved in yesterday." He studied me with eyes that had seen decades of people passing through. "Margaret's place. Good woman. Quiet spot out there." He rang up the washer, which cost less than a coffee in my old neighborhood. "You know how to install it?" I admitted I didn't. He came around the counter and spent 10 minutes explaining the process, drawing diagrams on the back of my receipt, his patience infinite in a way I'd forgotten people could be. When I thanked him, he waved it off. Nobody knows everything. That's what neighbors are for. The word neighbor struck me as strange. I'd lived in the same building for over a decade and couldn't have named 3 people who shared my floor. Here, miles from anyone, strangers were already neighbors by default. The realization carried both comfort and unease. Installing the washer took me twice as long as it should have, working by trial and error, and the hardware store owner sketched instructions. When I finally got the pump reassembled and working without that grinding sound, I felt victorious in a way that seemed absurd for such a simple repair. But it wasn't simple, not for me. Every small task I completed without calling for help was evidence that I could survive alone, that the helplessness Derek had cultivated in me wasn't permanent. The days began to blur together, each one structured around basic survival tasks that somehow filled the hours. I learned to start fires in the wood stove after several failed attempts that filled the cottage with smoke. I figured out which hiking trails led where through trial and error and occasional mild panic when I got turned around. I discovered the library in town, a single room attached to the community center, where a librarian named Helen welcomed me without curiosity or judgment and recommended books that had nothing to do with my situation. 2 weeks passed before I realized I hadn't cried since arriving at the cottage. The constant emotional turbulence that had defined those first days after Derek left had settled into something quieter, a persistent ache rather than acute agony. I still thought about him, about the marriage, about everything I'd lost, but the thoughts had less power to derail me completely. I established routines without consciously deciding to. Morning coffee at the table watching the lake. Midday work on whatever cottage project needed attention. Afternoon walk through the forest or swim from the dock when the day was warm enough. Evening reading by oil lamp until my eyes grew heavy. Simple rhythms that required nothing from me except presence. The woman who'd helped with the pump, whose name was Dorothy, appeared one morning with a basket of vegetables from her garden and an invitation to dinner at her place the following week. I almost declined automatically, the thought of socializing exhausting, but something in her matter-of-fact kindness made me accept. She nodded as if I'd passed some test and left without requiring conversation I wasn't ready for. Dinner at Dorothy's small farmhouse 3 miles down the road introduced me to her husband Walter, a retired forestry worker with hands like tree roots and a quiet demeanor that matched his wife's. They didn't ask about my past or why I'd appeared suddenly in Margaret's cottage. Instead, Dorothy taught me how to can vegetables while Walter explained the best fishing spots on the lake. They treated my ignorance of basic skills without condescension, as if learning was expected rather than shameful. "We all start somewhere," Dorothy said, watching me struggle to remove air bubbles from a jar of pickled beans. "I couldn't boil water when Walter and I got married. Now look at me." She gestured to the shelves lining her kitchen walls, hundreds of jars glowing like jewels in the lamplight. I left their house with a box of canning jars and a list of equipment I'd need, plus an open invitation to return anytime. Walking back to the cottage under stars more numerous than I'd ever seen, I felt something shift inside me. Not happiness exactly, but maybe the absence of active misery. A neutral space where healing might eventually happen. The morning I decided to tackle the overgrown garden behind the cottage marked the end of my 3rd week in this strange new existence. I'd noticed it during my wanderings around the property, a rectangle of land bordered by rotting wooden posts that had once held fencing. Weeds had claimed the space completely, but beneath the chaos I could see the bones of what had been carefully tended rows. Something about those ghost lines called to me, whispered possibilities I wasn't ready to name. I found gardening tools in the shed, their metal surfaces spotted with rust but still functional. A spade, a hoe, a rake with several broken tines. I stood at the edge of that wild tangle feeling utterly incompetent. I'd never gardened in my life. Our penthouse had boasted expensive orchids that a service came to maintain. Before that, my childhood home had a lawn care company. I'd never deliberately placed a seed in soil and coaxed it toward life. But I needed something to do with my hands, something to fill the long days that stretched endlessly when I wasn't making cottage repairs. The physical work had become necessary, not just to improve my living space but to exhaust my body enough that sleep came easier at night. So I drove the spade into the earth and began the slow process of reclaiming what had been lost to neglect. The work was brutally hard. Roots from the weeds had woven themselves into an impenetrable mat just below the surface. My soft hands, still bearing faint traces of my last manicure from a life that felt decades past, blistered within an hour. Sweat soaked through my shirt despite the cool morning air. My back screamed protest with every thrust of the spade. I worked until my arms trembled with fatigue, clearing perhaps 10 square feet, a laughably small dent in the project. That night my hands were too sore to grip a fork properly at dinner. I ate soup again, something that required minimal utensil coordination, and stared at my palms in the lamplight. Blisters had formed and broken, leaving raw patches that stung when I flexed my fingers. The old me would have been horrified by this damage, would have immediately sought treatment and manicures to restore perfection. This new version of myself felt something different. Pride, maybe. Evidence that I'd pushed my body beyond its comfortable limits and survived. I returned to the garden the next morning and the morning after that. Each day I could work a little longer before exhaustion forced me to stop. The blisters gradually hardened into calluses. My back adjusted to the constant bending and lifting. The cleared area expanded slowly, revealing dark soil that looked rich and promising beneath years of accumulated weeds. Dorothy appeared one afternoon while I was working, materializing at the garden's edge like she'd been summoned by some signal I hadn't known I'd sent. She stood watching for several minutes before speaking, her weathered face thoughtful. "You're doing it the hard way," she finally said, not unkindly. "Come on. I'll show you." She demonstrated proper technique, how to leverage the spade's weight rather than forcing it, how to identify which roots needed full removal and which could be chopped and left to decompose. She brought me work gloves from her truck, thick leather ones that had belonged to Walter, worn soft from years of use. Under her patient instruction, my efficiency doubled. "What are you planning to plant?" she asked as we worked side by side, her movements economical and practiced where mine remained clumsy but improving. I paused, realizing I hadn't thought that far ahead. "I don't know. I've never grown anything before." Dorothy nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Start simple then. Tomatoes are hard to kill. Beans grow themselves practically. Lettuce likes the cool weather we've got coming." She pulled a small notebook from her pocket and sketched a basic garden layout, talking through timing and spacing and companion planting with the easy confidence of someone who'd been doing this since childhood. That evening she returned with seedlings from her greenhouse, flat after flat of small plants with their roots carefully wrapped. Tomatoes, peppers, several varieties of beans, lettuce, herbs I'd only ever seen in grocery stores or dried in jars. She helped me plant them in the cleared rows, showing me proper depth and spacing, how to water without drowning or neglecting. "They'll need attention," she warned as we finished the last row. "Every day. Weeding and watering and watching for pests. Plants aren't like projects you finish and forget. They're relationships. You have to show up." Her words struck deeper than she probably intended. Showing up. Being present. Maintaining connection through consistent attention. All the things I'd failed at in my marriage, too busy performing the role of perfect wife to actually be present in the relationship. But maybe plants could teach me what people hadn't. Maybe I could learn reliability and consistency in this small contained space before attempting anything larger. I tended that garden with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. Every morning I walked the rows, checking for new growth, pulling tiny weeds before they could establish themselves, feeling the soil's moisture level with my increasingly competent hands. I watched for the specific pests Dorothy had warned about, learned to identify beneficial insects from destructive ones. I measured water carefully, neither drowning nor neglecting my charges. The first tomato to ripen felt like a miracle. I'd watched its progress for weeks, the green orb slowly swelling and then beginning its transformation to red. The morning I judged it ready for harvest, I stood in the garden cradling that single tomato like it was made of precious metal. I'd grown this. My hands, my attention, my daily commitment had transformed a seedling into food. The accomplishment was so disproportionate to its objective value that I almost laughed. A single tomato. But it represented something I couldn't quite articulate, proof of something I was just beginning to understand about myself. I sliced that tomato carefully, arranged it on a plate with salt and nothing else, and ate it slowly at the cottage table. The flavor exploded in my mouth, so intense and complex that grocery store tomatoes seemed like different species entirely. This tasted like sunlight and soil and time. This tasted like patience rewarded. I ate every bite with reverent attention, aware I was consuming more than just fruit. I was eating evidence of my own capability. The garden transformed from project to anchor point in my days. I woke thinking about what needed attention. I planned my other activities around optimal watering times. I started keeping a journal documenting what worked and what failed, my first attempt at recording knowledge rather than just experiences. The pages filled with notes about germination times and pest management and which varieties thrived in this particular soil. Walter appeared one morning with lumber and wire fencing, helping me construct proper raised beds that would last for years. He worked mostly in silence, measuring and cutting and hammering with the precision of someone who'd built 1,000 similar structures. When we finished, he stood back assessing our work with a critical eye. "You've got a good hand for this," he said finally. "Garden looks healthy." That takes commitment. The compliment from this taciturn man who spoke perhaps 50 words a day felt more valuable than any praise I'd received in my previous life. He was commenting on observable skill, on tangible results, not on my appearance or my ability to organize a dinner party or my success at making my husband look good in front of his colleagues. As summer deepened, the garden exploded with abundance. I harvested vegetables faster than I could eat them, which led to Dorothy teaching me preservation methods. We spent long afternoons in her kitchen, processing tomatoes into sauce, pickling cucumbers and beans, making jam from wild berries Walter collected. My hands learned to move with increasing confidence, following recipes that weren't written down, that existed only in Dorothy's muscle memory and now gradually in mine. The physical work was changing my body in ways I noticed when catching unexpected glimpses of myself in the spotted bathroom mirror. My softness had transformed to lean muscle. My skin had darkened from constant sun exposure, and I'd stopped bothering with makeup weeks ago. My hair, which I'd kept professionally colored and styled throughout my marriage, now showed silver threads I didn't bother hiding. The woman in the mirror looked vital and strong in ways the previous version never had despite expensive gym memberships and careful diet maintenance. I started exploring further from the cottage as my confidence grew. The forest that had seemed threatening in those first days now felt welcoming. I learned to identify trees by their bark and leaves. I discovered clearings where deer grazed in early morning. I found a stream that fed the lake, its water so cold and clear I could see every stone on its bottom. These discoveries felt like gifts, small secrets the land was willing to share now that I'd proven I wasn't just passing through. Helen the librarian became an unexpected teacher. She noticed my questions about plant identification and local ecology, and started setting aside books for me, field guides and nature writing and practical manuals about sustainable living. We developed a routine where I'd stop by the library every few days, returning borrowed books and collecting new ones, sometimes staying to talk about what I'd learned or ask questions about topics I was just beginning to explore. "You're settling in," she observed one afternoon as I checked out a stack of books about soil building and composting. It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. This place has a way of keeping people who fit. And releasing those who don't. "You're starting to fit." Her words stayed with me as I drove back to the cottage. Fitting. Belonging. These weren't concepts I'd thought much about in my previous life. I'd spent so much energy trying to fit into the shape Derek wanted, molding myself to match his expectations, that I'd never considered whether I actually belonged in that life. Here, I wasn't trying to fit anything. I was just existing, responding to immediate needs, learning as I went. And somehow that authentic stumbling was creating belonging where performance had only created hollow approximation. The hardware store owner, whose name I'd learned was Bill, started greeting me by name when I came in for supplies. He'd ask about specific cottage repairs I'd mentioned on previous visits, following up like he actually cared about the outcomes. He introduced me to other regulars, farmers and builders and craftspeople who treated me like someone worth knowing rather than evaluating. I learned their names, their stories told in fragments over weeks of casual encounters. There was Ruth who ran the small cafe on Main Street, who'd started setting aside day-old bread for me when she learned I was feeding the ducks that nested by my dock. There was Tom, who managed the gas station and knew everything about small engine repair, who'd patiently walked me through chainsaw maintenance when I'd mentioned wanting to clear some fallen trees. There was Patricia, who taught at the elementary school, who invited me to volunteer reading to students, an offer I'd accepted with surprising enthusiasm. These connections formed gradually, organically, without the forced networking of my previous existence. No one wanted anything from me except basic human reciprocity. No one was assessing my value based on my husband's status or my ability to facilitate business connections. They accepted me as I presented myself, this strange woman who'd appeared in Margaret's cottage and was slowly transforming from obvious outsider to tentative community member. 4 months into my stay, Dorothy invited me to help with their hay harvest. I'd never done farm labor, had no idea what it entailed, but I showed up at dawn as requested. The work was punishing. Loading heavy bales onto trailers under a relentless sun, sweat soaking through clothes within the first hour, muscles I didn't know existed screaming protest. But there was something almost meditative about the repetitive physical labor, the steady rhythm of lift and stack, your mind emptying of everything except the immediate task. We broke for lunch in the field, sitting in the shade of the trailer eating sandwiches Dorothy had packed. There were half a dozen people helping with the harvest, neighbors and friends who'd come without being asked because that's what you did here. They talked about local news and upcoming events, included me naturally in conversations, asked my opinion about things I had no business having opinions about but offered them anyway. "You'll come to the harvest dinner," Dorothy said, making it a statement rather than question. "Everyone does. It's next Saturday at the community center." I wanted to decline automatically, the introvert in me recoiling from large social gatherings. But these people had shown me nothing but kindness and patience. They'd taught me skills and welcomed me without demanding explanations for my sudden appearance in their midst. I owed them at least an attempt at fuller participation in their community rhythms. The harvest dinner was overwhelming in the best way. The community center's main room filled with long tables covered in dishes people had brought, more food than the 100 or so attendees could possibly consume. The noise level was intense, conversations and laughter bouncing off the walls, children racing between tables while adults caught up on gossip and news. I stood frozen just inside the door, uncertain where I fit in this chaos. Dorothy appeared at my elbow, guiding me through the crowd, introducing me to people whose names I'd forget immediately, loading my plate with samples from various dishes. She deposited me at a table with several women around my age, then disappeared back into the crowd. The women welcomed me easily, pulling me into their discussion about the upcoming school year and whose children were in which grades and the new teacher the district had hired. I contributed little to the conversation, content to listen and observe. But I noticed how they included me anyway, making space for my silence without drawing attention to it, occasionally directing easy questions my way that required minimal response. By the end of the evening, I'd laughed more than I had in months, genuine laughter that came from shared humor rather than polite performance. Walking back to my car in the dark parking lot, I felt something shift inside my chest. A loosening of tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. These people weren't Derek's colleagues' wives who'd measured me against impossible standards. They weren't performing or competing or jockeying for status. They were just living their lives and had made room for me to live mine among them. That night I sat on the cottage porch listening to night sounds that had become familiar. Frogs calling from the lake shore. Wind moving through the pines. The occasional distant call of an owl. My hands rested on my lap, calloused and capable, dirt permanently embedded under my nails despite scrubbing. These hands bore no resemblance to the soft manicured ones that had gripped champagne flutes at Derek's work functions. These hands had built and planted and harvested. These hands had created something real. I pulled out my phone, which I'd been checking less frequently as weeks passed, and found it had died days ago. I'd stopped charging it religiously, stopped caring about the messages I might be missing. But tonight some impulse made me carry it inside and plug it into the charger I'd nearly forgotten existed. While it powered up, I made tea and sat at the table watching the screen slowly illuminate. The notifications flooded in when the phone finally connected. Emails and messages, most of them spam or automated, but buried among them were several from Derek's lawyer. The most recent was marked urgent, sent 3 days ago. I opened it with hands that had started trembling, the teacup rattling slightly against its saucer. The message was brief and to the point. Derek was finalizing the divorce and needed my signature on additional documents. The settlement had been adjusted, his lawyer wrote, reflecting my failure to contest the initial offer within the specified timeframe. The new amount was significantly less than what had originally been proposed. I needed to respond within a week or they would proceed without my input, and I would receive whatever the court decided to award, which would likely be even less. I stared at the screen, reading the words multiple times without them fully registering. Some distant part of me knew I should feel angry or panicked. This was my financial future being diminished with each passing day of my silence. I should call a lawyer, should fight back, should protect myself from Derek's continued manipulation. But sitting in this cottage I'd slowly transformed into home, surrounded by evidence of my growing competence, I felt something unexpected instead of anger. Relief. The divorce was moving forward. The legal dissolution of a marriage that had died months ago was finally happening. Soon I would be officially free of Derek, free of the woman I'd been when married to him, free to continue becoming whoever I was discovering myself to be in this strange new life. The money mattered less than I'd thought it would. I'd learned to live on very little. I'd developed skills that translated to self-sufficiency. I didn't need Derek's money to survive, which meant I didn't need to fight him for it. I typed a response to his lawyer, brief and emotionless. I would sign whatever documents they sent. I agreed to the adjusted settlement. I wanted this finished. I provided the cottage address for delivery of papers, the first time I'd acknowledged this location to anyone from my previous existence. Then I turned off the phone again, not bothering to check the other messages waiting for attention, and returned to the porch with my tea. The relief I felt was profound and complicated. Part of me knew I was probably making a terrible financial decision, that I should fight for every dollar I could extract from a man who'd discarded me so carelessly. But fighting meant staying connected, meant prolonging the entanglement, meant continuing to let Derek have power over my emotional state. I'd spent 4 months learning to live without him, building a life that bore no resemblance to our marriage. I wanted that life more than I wanted his money. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who looked confused by the remote location and dirt road barely wide enough for his van. I signed for the thick envelope and carried it inside, setting it on the kitchen table where it sat like an unexploded device while I went about my morning routine. Water the garden. Feed the chickens Dorothy had given me last month. Make coffee. Check the tomato plants for hornworms. Ordinary tasks that had become the architecture of my days. It took me until afternoon to open the envelope. The legal language was dense and impersonal, reducing 2 decades to clauses and stipulations. Derek kept the penthouse and the mountain property. I received a cash settlement that was frankly insulting given the length of our marriage, but I'd already agreed to it. He kept his retirement accounts. I got nothing from his business. The division was so lopsided it would have made any decent lawyer weep, but I'd surrendered the right to contest when I'd stopped responding to his attempts at communication. I should sign and return them immediately, get this finished. Instead I placed the papers back in their envelope and left them on the table while I walked down to the lake. The afternoon was warm, summer sliding toward autumn but not quite ready to let go. I stripped to my underwear and waded into the cold water, diving under when it reached my waist. The shock of temperature drove every thought from my mind, leaving only the immediate physical sensation of cold and movement. I swam until my arms burned and my lungs ached, then floated on my back staring at the sky. Clouds drifted past in shapes that meant nothing, their shadows moving across the water's surface like living things. My body had become strong from months of physical labor, capable of swimming distances that would have been impossible when I'd first arrived. I'd changed in ways that had nothing to do with Derek or our marriage or the papers waiting on my table. Those changes belonged entirely to me. When I finally returned to the cottage, dripping lake water across the floor, I found Dorothy's truck parked in my driveway. She sat on the front steps with Walter, both of them patient as stones, clearly willing to wait as long as necessary. I wrapped myself in a towel and joined them, self-conscious about my wet hair and lack of proper clothes, but not enough to go change first. Saw the courier, Dorothy said without preamble. Figured you might need company. I didn't ask how she knew what the courier had delivered. Small towns had information networks that made social media look primitive. Someone had probably called someone who'd called someone else, and now half the area likely knew that papers from the city had arrived for the woman in Margaret's cottage. I should have felt invaded, but instead I felt held, surrounded by a web of casual attention that had somehow become care. I need to sign them, I said, stating the obvious. It'll be finished then. Walter, who I'd heard speak perhaps 50 complete sentences in all the months I'd known him, surprised me by responding. Endings aren't clean like people think. Papers don't finish anything. They just make it legal. The actual finishing takes longer. His words settled over us like autumn leaves, their wisdom earned through experience I could only guess at. We sat in silence for several minutes before Dorothy stood, brushing invisible dust from her jeans. Come to dinner tomorrow, she said. We're butchering chickens and you should learn. Useful skill. Plus it helps to have something to do with your hands when your head's full of noise. They left without waiting for my agreement, as if my attendance was already decided. I returned to the table where the papers waited, picked up a pen, and signed my name in all the indicated places. My signature looked different than it had months ago, less careful and precise, more confident in its imperfection. I sealed everything back in the envelope and left it for the courier to collect whenever he returned through this area. Sleep came hard that night. My mind insisted on replaying memories I'd mostly succeeded in avoiding, moments from the marriage that now looked different through the lens of its ending. Our wedding day, Derek's face when I walked down the aisle, his expression that I'd read as love but now looked like satisfaction. Our honeymoon, how he'd planned every activity without consulting me, and how I'd found his decisiveness romantic rather than controlling. Our first apartment, how he'd gradually taken over all financial decisions because he was better with numbers, creating a dependence I hadn't recognized as intentional. I watched the memories like films of strangers, unable to reconcile the woman I'd been with who I was now. Had I really been that passive? That willing to disappear into someone else's life? The evidence was undeniable, yet it felt like watching someone else's story, someone I'd known briefly but no longer had any connection to. Morning arrived with rain, steady and cold, announcing autumn's imminent arrival. I dressed in layers and drove to Dorothy's through weather that would have kept me inside during my previous life. She'd already started the butchering process when I arrived, moving through it with the efficiency of someone who'd performed this task hundreds of times. The work was messy and difficult and deeply practical, transforming living birds into food for the freezer. She explained each step while demonstrating, patient with my squeamishness and fumbling incompetence. First time's the hardest, she said, handing me a knife. Your hands know it's strange. But we eat meat. This is where it comes from. Being squeamish about it is just being dishonest about what you consume. Her matter-of-fact approach helped. This wasn't cruel, it was necessary. These chickens had lived good lives in Dorothy's yard, far better than factory farm birds. Their deaths were quick and purposeful. Learning to process them myself felt like taking responsibility for my choices, acknowledging the real cost of the food I ate. By the end of the afternoon, I could do the work without flinching, my hands steady and sure. We cleaned up in companionable silence, scrubbing blood from our hands and tools, packaging the processed meat. Dorothy made tea while I stoked the wood stove against the damp cold creeping through the house. When we finally sat down, exhaustion settling into my bones, she studied me with the direct gaze that meant she had something important to say. Margaret called, she said. Her travel plans changed. She's coming back next month instead of spring. The words hit harder than expected. I'd known this was temporary, that the cottage was borrowed time, but some part of me had stopped thinking about the deadline. I'd grown roots here, shallow maybe but real. The thought of leaving twisted something in my chest. Where will you go? Dorothy asked, and the question hung between us heavy with implications. I don't know. The admission felt like failure. 5 months here and I had no plan beyond this moment, no vision of what came next. I'd been so focused on surviving day to day that I'd avoided thinking about the future. Back to the city, I suppose. Find an apartment. Look for work. Dorothy made a noncommittal sound that conveyed her opinion without words. There's other options. Bill's place has been sitting empty since his mother passed. He mentioned yesterday he's thinking about renting it. Small house, needs work, but solid. And Patricia was asking if you'd consider teaching art at the school. Part-time, but steady. Not much money, but enough if you're careful. I stared at her, trying to process what she was offering. Not just information, but a future. A reason to stay. These people I'd known for months were making space for me to remain, treating me like someone who belonged rather than someone passing through. The idea was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. I'm not a teacher, I said weakly. I haven't worked in architecture in decades. You grew a garden from nothing, Dorothy countered. You fixed up that cottage when you didn't know a hammer from a wrench. You learned to can and preserve and butcher chickens in an afternoon. Teaching kids to draw? You could do that in your sleep. Question isn't whether you're qualified. Question is whether you want to stay. Did I want to stay? The question I'd been avoiding since arriving suddenly demanded an answer. Staying meant committing to this small town, this quiet life, this version of myself that bore no resemblance to who I'd been. Staying meant accepting that my old life was truly over, not just paused or temporarily disrupted. Staying meant choosing this strange new existence over any possibility of returning to the familiar. But what was familiar? The city held only ghosts now. My marriage was legally dissolving as we spoke. The friends who'd populated my previous life had disappeared at the first sign of my changed status. My career had been abandoned so long ago that resurrection seemed impossible. What exactly was I returning to if I left this place? An expensive apartment I couldn't afford? Job applications that would go nowhere? The constant reminder of everything I'd lost? Here, I'd found something unexpected. Not happiness exactly, but purpose. Competence. Connection. People who valued me for what I could do rather than who I knew or how I looked or whose wife I was. I'd discovered skills I didn't know I possessed. I'd learned I could survive alone, could build a life from almost nothing. These weren't small things. I'll talk to Bill, I heard myself say, the decision-making itself. And Patricia. About the teaching. Dorothy nodded as if she'd known what I'd choose before I did. Good. This place suits you. Would have been a shame to see you leave just when you're starting to bloom. I drove back to the cottage through rain that had settled in for the duration, my mind spinning with the implications of what I'd just committed to. Staying here meant truly starting over, accepting wages that were laughable compared to my previous lifestyle, living in a small town where everyone knew your business and privacy was a fluid concept. It meant winters that would be harsh and isolation that could be crushing. It meant being far from the cultural amenities I'd taken for granted, the restaurants and galleries and theaters that had populated my weekends. But it also meant waking to birdsong instead of traffic. It meant community that was genuine rather than transactional. It meant work that produced tangible results, food I grew myself, skills that made me genuinely self-sufficient. It meant freedom from the constant performance my previous life had required. It meant the possibility of discovering who I actually was beneath all the layers I'd accumulated trying to be what others wanted. The cottage greeted me with familiar creaks and smells, with smoke and earth and the faint sweetness of tomatoes ripening on the counter. I lit the oil lamps against the early darkness, made soup from vegetables I'd grown, and ate slowly while considering this new future I'd just chosen. It wouldn't be easy. Small town life had challenges I was only beginning to understand. But it would be mine, built by my decisions and effort, owing nothing to Derek or anyone else. I slept deeply that night despite the rain drumming on the roof, and woke to clearing skies and the certain knowledge that I'd made the right choice. Over breakfast I composed an email to Derek's lawyer, confirming my signature on the divorce papers and providing forwarding information. Not the cottage address, which would soon not be mine, but a P.O. box I'd open in town. The first step in establishing permanent residence rather than temporary refuge. The meeting with Bill happened 2 days later at the hardware store. He walked me through his mother's house, pointing out issues that needed addressing with the straightforward honesty I'd come to expect from people here. The roof needed patching. The plumbing was temperamental. The electrical system was outdated though functional. The place hadn't been cleaned since his mother entered hospice 6 months ago, and dust covered every surface like snow. But the bones were good. 2 bedrooms, a functional kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace. A small yard with mature fruit trees and raised beds someone had built years ago. Windows that faced east, promising morning light. It was perhaps a third the size of the penthouse I'd left behind, but it felt more like home within 5 minutes of entering than that expensive space ever had. "I'm not looking to make money off this," Bill said as we stood on the sagging back porch. "Just want someone to take care of it, keep it from falling apart. Rent would be whatever you can manage. We can work out the details. You'd be doing me a favor, really, keeping the place occupied." We shook hands on an agreement that would have made any real estate lawyer weep, nothing in writing, just mutual trust and fair dealing. I'd move in after vacating Margaret's cottage, would handle minor repairs myself in exchange for reduced rent, would slowly transform this neglected house into home. The arrangement was so casual, so based on relationship rather than contract, that it still felt foreign to me. But I was learning to trust these people's word, to understand that in places like this, handshake deals meant more than legal documents. Patricia's offer came next, presented over coffee at Ruth's Cafe. She needed someone to teach art twice a week to combined middle and high school classes. The pay was minimal, the hours awkward, the students would likely be indifferent at best. But she believed exposure to creative thinking mattered, and the school had lost their art teacher when she'd relocated for her husband's job. The position had been empty for a year. Was I interested? I thought about my architecture degree, the creative work I'd once loved before abandoning it for Derek's convenience. I thought about the garden I'd designed and built, the way I'd learned to see the land and respond to its contours. I thought about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional with my own hands. Teaching kids to access that same creative process? It wouldn't be the career I'd once imagined, but it might be something better. Something real. "Yes," I told Patricia. "I'm interested." She smiled with visible relief. "Classes start in 2 weeks. That enough time to prepare?" It wasn't remotely enough time, but I nodded anyway. I'd learned that readiness was overrated, that sometimes you just had to start and figure it out as you went. I'd done it with gardening and home repair and chicken butchering. I could do it with teaching. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. I moved my belongings from the cottage to Bill's mother's house, which required only 2 trips in my car given how little I owned. Dorothy helped me clean the new place, our combined effort transforming it from dusty shrine to livable space. Walter fixed the worst of the plumbing issues and showed me how to maintain what remained. Neighbors appeared with housewarming gifts, food and furniture and small items to make the house functional. I prepared for teaching by developing lesson plans that bore no resemblance to my own art education, which had been formal and technical and utterly joyless. I wanted something different for these kids, something that emphasized exploration and personal expression. I gathered supplies from thrift stores and my own limited resources, creating starter kits that would allow experimentation without expensive materials. Margaret returned to her cottage with gifts from her travels and effusive thanks for leaving the place in better condition than she'd lent it. We sat on her porch drinking tea while she told stories about adventures abroad, and when she learned I was staying in the area, her face lit with genuine pleasure. "I'd hoped you might," she said. "This place has a way of keeping people who need it. I'm glad you're one of them." My first day teaching arrived with unseasonable cold and my nerves stretched taut as wire. 15 students filed into the art room, their faces ranging from curious to suspicious to bored. They'd had no art instruction for over a year and clearly expected this to be another waste of time inflicted by adults who didn't understand them. I stood at the front of the room acutely aware of my complete lack of teaching experience, my inadequate supplies, my uncertain authority. "I don't know what I'm doing," I told them honestly. "I haven't taught before. But I used to design buildings, and before that I loved making things with my hands." So we're going to figure this out together. I'm going to show you some techniques, and you're going to experiment and make mistakes and occasionally create something you're proud of. Sound fair? The honesty seemed to surprise them. One girl in the back raised her hand tentatively. What if we're not good at art? Then you're exactly like everyone else, I said. Being good isn't the point. Making something that didn't exist before you made it, that's the point. We've got 2 hours twice a week to make things. That's all this is. Making things. I introduced the first project, intentionally simple, asking them to draw their hands in different positions using only pencil. No pressure to make it perfect, just observation and recording what they saw. They worked with varying degrees of engagement, but they worked. By the end of class, 15 drawings covered the drying rack, each one unique, each one evidence that creation had occurred. Walking to my car after that first class, exhaustion and exhilaration mixing in equal measure, I felt something shift permanently inside my chest. I'd stood in front of those kids and been genuinely myself, uncertain and learning and trying anyway. I hadn't performed or pretended expertise I didn't have. I'd just shown up authentically, and somehow that had been enough. That evening I sat on the sagging porch of my new house, watching sunset paint the sky in colors my garden had taught me to name. Tomato red. Pepper orange. The particular gold of squash blossoms. The divorce was final, papers processed, marriage legally terminated. Derek existed somewhere in a life that had nothing to do with mine. The woman I'd been when married to him was gone, dissolved like sugar in water, her component parts redistributed into something unrecognizable. The knock on my door came on a Saturday morning 6 months after I'd settled into Bill's mother's house, 6 months into teaching, 6 months into this life I'd built from the wreckage of my marriage. I was elbow deep in pie dough, preparing for the community potluck that evening, when the sound interrupted my rhythm. Flour dusted my arms and apron as I wiped my hands and moved toward the door, expecting Dorothy or perhaps one of my students dropping off an assignment. Instead, Derek stood on my porch. The shock froze me mid-step. He looked exactly as I remembered and completely foreign at the same time. His expensive suit was immaculate despite the long drive. His hair was perfectly styled. His watch probably cost more than 3 months of my current salary. He belonged to a different world, one I'd inhabited so recently yet felt separated from by vast distance. Christine, he said, my name sounding strange in his voice after so many months of silence. We need to talk. I stood in the doorway, aware of my flour-covered clothes, my unpolished appearance, the modest house behind me that couldn't have been more different from the penthouse we'd shared. Some part of me wanted to feel embarrassed, to scramble to present myself as successful and thriving. But that impulse died quickly, replaced by something calmer and more solid. How did you find me? I asked, making no move to invite him inside. Your forwarding address from the divorce papers. I hired someone to track down the actual location. He shifted uncomfortably, perhaps registering my lack of welcome. Can I come in? I considered refusing, but curiosity won. I stepped aside, watching him take in the small living room with its second-hand furniture and walls I'd painted myself. His expression cycled through surprise and something that might have been pity. I felt nothing. This house was mine in ways the penthouse never had been. His judgment couldn't touch that. Why are you here, Derek? He sat uninvited on my couch, the expensive fabric of his suit incongruous against the worn upholstery. I made a mistake. Leaving you in Italy, the divorce, all of it. I wasn't thinking clearly. Jennifer, it's not what I thought it would be. He ran his hand through his hair, disrupting its perfection. I want to try again. I want you to come home. The words I might have desperately wanted to hear months ago now sounded hollow. I studied this man I'd spent 2 decades with, trying to find some flicker of the feelings that had once consumed me. There was nothing. He was a stranger wearing a familiar face, representing a life that no longer fit. This is my home, I said simply. This? He gestured around the room with undisguised disdain. Christine, be serious. You're living in some backwater town, teaching part-time at a rural school, living in a house that should probably be condemned. This isn't you. You're right, I agreed. It's not the me you knew. That woman doesn't exist anymore. You killed her when you drove away in Italy. What grew back is someone different. He stood, moving closer with the confidence of someone who'd always gotten what he wanted through persistence. I can fix this. I'll sell the penthouse if that's what you need. We can start fresh somewhere new. Travel like we always talked about. You can pursue your architecture again, I'll support you this time, I promise. His promises meant nothing. I'd heard them before, watched them dissolve the moment they became inconvenient. I don't want to travel with you. I don't want your support. I don't want any version of the life we had. I kept my voice level, stating facts without anger. You did me a favor, Derek. You abandoned me and forced me to discover I could survive without you. Turned out I do better without you. You can't possibly prefer this. He gestured toward the window, toward the small town beyond. You're living in poverty, wasting your education, surrounded by people who have nothing to offer you. They offered me community when I had nothing. They taught me skills you considered beneath us. They saw value in me that had nothing to do with being your wife. I moved to the door, opening it in clear dismissal. You came here because Jennifer isn't working out, not because you actually want me back. You want the idea of me, the woman who made your life comfortable. That woman is gone. He stood uncertain for the first time since arriving, his usual confidence cracking. What am I supposed to tell people? That my wife chose some nowhere town over our life together? Tell them whatever you want. Tell them I lost my mind. Tell them I'm having a breakdown. I don't care about those people or their opinions anymore. I held the door wider. Goodbye, Derek. He walked to the door but paused in the threshold. You'll regret this. When the novelty wears off and you're stuck here with nothing, you'll wish you'd come back. Maybe, I acknowledged. But it'll be my regret, my choice, my life. That's worth more than anything you're offering. I watched him drive away, his rental car kicking up dust as it disappeared down the road. When the sound of the engine faded completely, I returned to my pie dough, hands steady as I rolled it flat. Through the window I could see Dorothy's truck approaching, right on time to help me finish cooking for the potluck. She took one look at my face when I opened the door and understood immediately. He came. And left. I returned to the counter, cutting butter into flour. It's finished now. Really finished. Dorothy nodded, rolling up her sleeves to help. We worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from genuine friendship rather than obligation. By evening, my small house was filled with food and the sound of neighbors gathered around my table. Bill shared stories about his mother who'd lived here before me. Patricia discussed plans for expanding the art program. Walter offered advice about winterizing the house before snow arrived. These people had become my family not through blood or marriage but through consistent presence and mutual support. They'd welcomed me when I was broken and celebrated as I slowly became whole. They'd taught me that worth wasn't measured in possessions or status but in how you showed up for others and yourself. As the evening wound down and guests departed with promises to see each other soon, I stood on my porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere Derek was driving back to a life that no longer had space for me. Somewhere my old self existed only in memory. Here, in this present moment, I was exactly where I belonged. The wind carried the scent of approaching autumn, promising changes ahead. But I'd learned to welcome change, to trust my ability to adapt and grow. Whatever came next, I would face it with hands that knew how to build and harvest and create. I would face it as myself, finally, completely, without apology. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.